Welcome to the presentation on supporting international student athletes in post-pandemic collegiate athletics by Dr. Sujara Pasmino and Dr. Simon Pack. The year 2020 brought onto the entire world many challenges and uncertainty. In the collegiate athletic environment, two interrelated factors had an effect on international student athletes. First, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and second, the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, directives on online education. According to the NCAA, there were more than 20,000 international student athletes in 2020. Some international student athletes were barred from returning home due to the pandemic-driven border closures. Others anticipated that if they left, the U.S. travel restrictions would prevent them from returning for the fall 2020 semester. The purpose of this study is to explore the effects of COVID-19 and the ICE directives on international student athletes. Three research questions directed this study. First, what challenges do international student athletes face in light of the modification to sport activities? Second, what challenges do international student athletes face regarding the ICE directives? And third, what level of support do they feel their athletic department provide during these challenging times? The NCAA conducted a student-athlete COVID-19 well-being study. They collected 37,658 responses from student athletes. However, only 4% of those responses were from international student athletes. 33% of the student athletes were experiencing sleeping difficulties. These following results were very alarming. More than 25% reported feeling sadness and sense of loss. 10% reported feeling so depressed it was difficult to function. That is why it's very necessary to understand and acknowledge what international student athletes have to experience in order to identify an appropriate level of support. The NCAA also conducted a webinar with international student athletes and their view on navigating current events in the United States. The international student athletes that participated reported that at some point in time they had to decide if they had to stay in the United States or if they were going back to their home countries. In some cases, they were forced to stay, and in other cases, they were encouraged to go back. Those international student athletes that went back to their home countries reported having great support systems and having a lot of help in order to manage all the uncertainty. However, they became fearful of not being able to return for the new academic year. On cancellation of sporting events, well, they were disappointed at first, but pretty quickly they set new goals. Also, connected online with coaches and teammates that maintain a lot of information online. They received a lot of information from the athletic department. However, they wanted to have more honest and direct information. The international student athletes reported also facing financial and legal immigration challenges. It's important to mention in the previous study that the international student athletes might have a little bit of bias since the person directing the webinar was the director of the Office of Inclusion. That might affect a little bit of their responses. However, it's also important to mention this nested level of social structures. We mentioned that having that social support system is very important. And here we can identify the micro, meso, and macro levels. At the micro level, we have the individual and their family and mentors. We would like to include coaches in this mentor category. In the meso category, we have the community support, which we can include the teammates and the athletic department. At the meso level as well, the university, professors, or other students. And finally, at the macro level, the community where they live. This study is a qualitative study. It's currently underway, so we're going to present only preliminary results of semi-structured, in-depth interviews with international student athletes from Division 1 and Division 2. We use convenient and snowball sampling methods and triangulation with the semi-structured interviews, the NCAA information, and online public media sources. We also control for bias by detailing the data collection process, carefully collecting not just the interview information, but also the body language and the environment that we were able to observe during the interviews. And finally, the data analysis process. I would like to point out in this timeline of events 3 important points in time. First, in March 2020, the cancellation of sporting events, NCAA and international events as well, such as the Olympics, for example. At this point, the international student athletes have to pick and decide if they wanted to stay in the US or return to their countries. In July 2020, the second point in time, the ICE published their directives, and international student athletes, both the ones that stay in the United States and the ones that went back home, had to face challenges in regards to visa and preparation for the fall semester. The third point in time was during the fall semester and a little bit of the spring. International student athletes had to decide if they wanted to return or if they wanted to take 1 year off as a red shirt. And basically they had to deal with COVID-19 suspensions, cancellations of events, and so on. In the preliminary results, some common themes that we obtained from the interviews were support system, mental health, financial challenges, visa and OPT challenges, individual cases, situations, and their coaches. They mentioned a lot of the coaches. First of all, I'm going to present the support system. The international student athletes reporting not having close family in the United States. At least the international student athletes that were interviewed. They reported that their support system first is their coach, then their teammates, and finally the sport community. Included in this sport community are other international student athletes that practice the same sport, where they are friends from previous competitions. They also reported feeling appreciation from the athletic department and the support that they give them. However, they mentioned that they feel very distant and many times they don't understand their situation. This is a direct quote from one of the international student athletes. My coach is the first person I would contact in case of an emergency. However, they also mention we have to advocate for our own needs. They mention that they feel that nobody else is looking after them, that nobody is advocating for them. Some of the most frequent challenges were limited legal support for visas or other immigration status, and problems during quarantine or whenever they become sick, not having a designated provider for food or medicine. In the mental health, a lot of sadness and frustration with the cancellation of NCAA competition and international competition. We have to keep in mind that these are elite athletes and many of them were planning to compete and qualify to the Olympic Games. So they had not only the NCAA events canceled, but also the international competitions canceled. For those of them that went back home, they reported having an important support system. They really mentioned this was very helpful for them in order to overcome the uncertainty. However, for those that stay in the United States, they mentioned having limited support. They struggle with the challenges and the changes. They had to reach out to friends in order to find a place to stay. and many of them had to find a job in order to provide for themselves. They were also worried about maintaining their athletic condition and technical skills. Have in mind that these elite athletes train every day under a very strict regime. Regret of going back to the United States during the fall semester and spring semester because their coaches of the athletic department encouraged them to come back for the fall semester. Many of them had regrets of not having that social support that they were receiving at their home countries. Some of them even mentioned feeling not valued or forgotten. From a side note, and from the observations during the interview, you can clearly see when we touch these points, especially the third point in time during the fall semester and the spring semester, where a lot of cancellations, quarantine because of close contact happened. Many of these international student athletes just changed their body language. They become sad. They almost start crying when they were communicating this information. This was also very clear in the decorations of their departments or their rooms where they were staying. Nothing to decorate them, just extra information. On the financial challenges that they face whenever they had to decide to go back to their home countries in the first point in time, or in the second point in time when they decided to come back to the States for the fall semester, they had to buy tickets overnight, and these tickets are very expensive. Also, some international student athletes had to quarantine because of closures, and all these expenses were challenging for them. Some institutions offer support and some don't. Some institutions didn't. They needed to support themselves. However, because of the student visa limitations, they cannot work in the United States. So they really struggle to find ways to have some income in order to support themselves. When talking about visa and OPT opportunities, they didn't have a clear guidance of regulations in regards to the start of the fall semester. They were forced to take face-to-face classes in order to maintain their visa and their eligibility. They needed to have a legal counsel to find the best option whenever they reach the graduation. And some of the freshmen also mentioned having to face some challenges when arriving to the United States, because the ICU regulations, they needed to show their schedule, make sure that they didn't have all their classes online. Some of the individual cases, international student athletes were forced to stay during the summer, threatening to take the scholarship away if they cannot return for the fall semester. Also, some international student athletes felt responsible for the health and the health of their teammates, because if somebody got sick, their competitions would be canceled or they would not be able to participate. Since they had to go to face-to-face classes, they reported that regular students did not take care of themselves, and that posed a risk of contracting the virus for the international student athletes. Also, when they were in quarantine because of close contact, they could not test out of quarantine, even if they were not sick. If they were quarantined, they had to finish their quarantine, which in some cases meant to miss competitions, miss valuable time for practice and training, and this really make a big struggle for the international student athletes. When they mentioned the coach, the 90% of the international student athletes list their coach as their first emergency contact. The coach is their family support, but most of them reported not having a very close relationship with the coach during this time. They were let down in some situations. They didn't have a lot of contact or even communication. Teammates were a little more supportive than the coach, and they received support from friends in an emergency situation when they had to find a place to stay. In conclusion, as we can see, the themes that were mentioned most common our support system, mental health, which is related to the support system that we have, and the coach, which at the moment is a little bit disconnected. However, it should be the main piece of the support system. These first three topics that you see in green are some things that the athletic department is working with in order to provide support for international student athletes. The three other themes that you see here in red are the themes that are not being supported with: financial struggles, visa and OPT challenges, and these individual cases. How can we help individual cases? So they would like to provide feedback for those important issues and try to find ways to solve this problem. The international student athletes goal after graduation, they would like to have a little more guidance and what are the options after graduation. They have a lot of limitations in working in the United States because of the visa. Student visa prohibits them for working or limits them a lot in the amount of hours that they can work. However, there's a future challenge that is coming up with the new name, image, and likeness regulation. And how are they going to treat this for international student athletes? Finally, in the conclusion, we would like to inform that they received international student athletes receive support from their athletic department, coaches, teammates, especially during the first stages of the 2020 events. At the second point, a little less, and finally, during the fall semester and spring semester, they have felt less supported during this time. The support from each institution during the ICE directive was very limited. There's a big need to have legal advice in immigration matters. The need to have a very clear and honest communication between the coach, the athletic department, and the international student athletes in order to make the most informed decisions that will benefit the international student athlete and the institution. They really feel like they need to have an advocate, somebody that understands their situation and they can fight for their benefit in all these matters. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, we'll be glad to take them at these email addresses.